Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me loud in the back? Okay, perfect. It's great to be back in 2025. Almost a year break of a storage day. How many of us were there in 2023 S3 day when we did it in Conrad? Any hands? Any last participants? Okay, not. Okay. It's great to be here. I know first half was more focused on data management when it comes to what storage services, how data can be preserved, modernized, analyzed in terms of S3 tables. We also had sessions on FSX and the files side of it. The next second half, we will be focusing on data security, resiliences, modernizations around it. And there are a lot of good sessions from a customer experience we have actually captured, which gives a lot of time for you to correlate what is happening into the infrastructure side of it. Now with that, good afternoon everyone. My name is Sachin Bawse. I'm a solution architect, GTM specialist, AWS storage. I'm based out of Bangalore. Now today we're going to discuss about the business continuity. We all know when it comes to continuity, that's a business call. IT is something who facilitates that business to run as an ongoing process, right? Now today we're going to discuss 3 critical services from AWS, and there are tons of services which actually can be leveraged while deploying and working on business continuity, migrations, or resiliency part of it. Now, what do we need to succeed, right, when it comes to resiliency specifically? I'll start with resiliency, I'll go to the migration, and then I'll end it up with the resiliency part of it. So, what do you need in order to succeed? The most of the business has resiliency as their own requirement, right? For customer A, the resiliency will have a different definition. For customer B, there will be a different definition. There's always a thin line between your high availability, disaster recovery, and data protection part of it, which I'll try to clarify and give you that framework around it, so that when you look into your infrastructure set of services, you can actually correlate those blueprint and deploy it as a best practices, what AWS is actually recommending it. Now, this is a classic slide and most of us might have seen it from a disaster recovery perspective. There are 3 simple tenets to it, right? Whenever a disaster recovery needs to be built, an architect, right? The left-hand side focuses on more on how much data you can afford to lose, which is your RPO, so recovery point objective we call it. The right tangent talk about recovery time objective, that means amount of time it will take to spin off and make the application and instances available for our infrastructure and services, right? And in between that is the disaster, which could happen due to natural calamities, technical failures, and nowadays ransomware attacks, which is happening and completely disrupting the infrastructure services which customers are running in. So customer always choose and define their DR plans based on these metrics when it comes to defining the disaster recovery services. Now, the reason I put this slide right now, in India, we all know there are a major proportion of customers who are still using on-premises as their certain workload, and they're using AWS or other service providers for their extension of services in terms of DR or in terms of backup or in terms of long-term retention copies around it, right? Now, if you see on this slide, right, this primarily talk about that, let's say a customer who has an infrastructure running in for a high performance workload, they need to invest that infrastructure and build those application landscape on their primary site. Now, since it's a business critical application, you also need to create another recovery site, which will probably double the investment in terms of what you need to spend on it. So your cost becomes 2x when it comes to keeping the same infrastructure and the underlying infrastructure in terms of performance, in terms of storage, in terms of compute services, what is required, right? So that's a 2x cost to our customers if they go with the old way, right? This was probably a 5 years or 10 years old mechanism. What we've seen is customers are now started using AWS as a disaster recovery site. And if there is one word which we can come up to choose AWS, there is one word which is called elasticity. Now, people can debate in terms of it could be durability, security, other services around it, but elasticity is something which is closer to the environment we just spoke on, right? So if, let's say you have a primary site, and probably go to the next one, if you have your primary site, you need not to invest the same amount of infrastructure in terms of performance, storage services, networking, compute onto the AWS side of it, right? And that's where the dollar signs, if you see in terms of investment, because that's a pay-as-you-grow model for a customer surrounded from an OpEx investment. So a cloud-based disaster recovery is what we have seen is coming up for most of the customers to deploy and choose in. One, it actually saves the cost for a customer from a dollar perspective. That means you don't need a double investment to be done in. Plus, there are a lot of customers who need to perform DR drills, right? Imagine in the first scenario where you need to keep the same infrastructure for it. In this scenario, you just keep it, the infrastructure as and when the DR drill needs to be performed. And once the drill is complete, you can just shut it down and terminate the instance around it. So as a customer, you just pay for, let's say, a day if you're performing a DR drill on it. That's a major advantage for a customer when it comes to elasticity. Now the first tool I'm going to talk about or service is data sync. Now let's talk about movement of data between your on-premises to AWS. Now what does data sync does? It's a very simplified, accelerated data movement between your on-premises to AWS or to any other provider to AWS as well. There are a list of other providers which we support from a source perspective, and we can actually get into more details on it. But there are four key pillars when it comes to data sync. One is accelerate. Accelerate talks about is a continuous sync of your data from any source location to AWS. A lot of customers who wanted to do asynchronous replications or who has a amount of big RPO and RTO in terms of keeping one copy offsite in case of primary data fails. That is one, the motion which comes with data sync around it. The second is migrate. Now, since data sync works as a continuous replication engine, the agent gets deployed in an on-premises and you'll be able to replicate back in AWS. In AWS, you have plethora of platform storage services which data sync supports, right? So you can choose your high-performance tiers started with EBS, can go to EFS, FSX, S3 around it. There are a lot of customers who has cold data sitting in on-premises, and they're using data sync to move it to S3 as a glacier. If you remember your quiz 1, that was a question about it. What is the lowest cost commercially viable option with S3? That was S3 Glacier. So a lot of customers use data sync to migrate their cold data from on-premises so that you can actually claim the storage space in on-prem and move that data to AWS on S3 Glacier. There are 7 storage of classes we have. The third is protect. Now customers wanted to use AWS as their backup to cloud or a long-term retention copy as well, right? Data sync actually can help you on it. So this is the tool we're talking from a migration perspective. Then we'll get into the DR and the backup platform. And last comes the archive. So you can actually reduce your on-premises storage costs. In S3, it can actually start with $23 per terabyte and can go till 1 cent per GB, right? So that's the huge difference of cost economics available for our customers to choose in when it comes to deploying and choose S3 as a target destination. Now just quick high-level workflow in terms of architecture, how it looks like. So in on-premises, if you see, what all source services data sync support? It supports your traditional protocol like NFS, SMB. It supports your HDFS. It also supports your object storage in on-premises. And in AWS, well, there are only 3 icons mentioned here, but there are tons of other storage services can be used as a part of your destination on AWS. Now let's go deep dive into it. We've been talking about moving the data from any of the source location, could be your on-premises or any other providers to AWS. But when it comes to moving your application also along with the data, that's where Elastic Disaster Recovery Service comes in, right? So EDR has been there for some time, and there are a lot of customers who are evaluating and using this service to perform all these combinations around it, right? So you can actually move your application stack, including your OS, databases, and data from on-premises to AWS, from other clouds to AWS, from AWS region to AWS region. So there is a cross-region capability also being supported with DR. You can also move it between the availability zones as well, right? In India, we have 2 regions with 3 availability zone each. That means Bombay and Hyderabad. Each has 3 availability zone, which adds to 6 availability zones available for our customers in India, which itself define the high availability, redundancy, resiliency, what you can actually build in. EDR will actually help you to build any combinations if you are natively completely on AWS or you're running in any other provider or in any on-premises infrastructure instances. Now, how does EDR works? I mean, just on a high level, it's a flexible. You get an agent to deploy it in an on-premises. It can capture any source, any OS. There are a wide range of OS interoperability metrics which is available on user guide. We can have a look of it. And it also support your on-premises / cloud workloads around it, right? So it doesn't matter what is the underlying platform you have on source. EDR is flexible enough to support and discover those assets when you perform a replication task to it. It's reliable because it's non-disruptive. It performs asynchronous replication. That means there will be less load on your on-premises infrastructure. A lot of customers are actually using it. And since it's asynchronous, it can actually go as low as in seconds when it comes to RPO requirement for those set of customers around it. Since it can actually do and replicate the instances, services, data application tag in seconds, that's the business continuum model we have been talking about. And the last pillar which comes is a highly automated. Once EDR has been deployed, the interface connectivity between your source location and AWS has been defined. That's a continuous channel which has been opened and worked on it. There's no impact on testing. We'll talk about more on what are the testing capabilities we have with EDR. And the total cost of ownership for customers, because once you land on AWS, then you have multiple choice of services to modernize and to optimize your cost, which is running on your applications on it, right? So for example, let's say you have a VMware workload in on-premises. While using a EDR, you move to AWS. Then you can actually convert those VM images to containers, Kubernetes. There are a plethora of services which are available for customers to modernize as well. Now, from a single process, so this is what EDR actually perform, right? So you will have a setup that will define the settings in terms of what assets, what application stacks and data I need to replicate, and then perform the launch instances in a non-disruptive test. This will be performed on AWS. You can actually operate and maintain the monitoring task, which is a periodic task of it. It get integrated with CloudTrail and CloudWatch. And you can actually perform a failover for your on-premises or any source location. EDR also gives you option to fail back, right? So you can actually initiate replication to return back to the primary site. So use AWS as your DR site for a DR drill, or as well as for a secondary site, which can be used as a recovery, and then you can actually fail back to your primary site, whichever location it is, right? Whether it's in on-premises or any other provider, you can just fail back to the original locations using EDR as a template. Now, on the high-level architecture perspective, right, the source location, as I was talking about, it could be any data center or cloud on it. It performs a continuous block replication in a compressed and encrypted format. We've been talking about ransomware protection around it. EDR also gives you native snapshot capability, which can be locked, encrypted, and the best part your user credentials could be completely different from what the user credentials you're using in on-premises, right? So imagine you have a team on-premises who has an access to your on-prem assets. You can actually divide a team and give a different access and credential using IAM policies and security posture controls what we have on AWS, keeping this site completely isolated and in a bunker recovery site for our customers around it, right? So even if any compromise happen from the credential side of or the user side of it, this recovery of data will be much more easier and faster with EDR around it. And since it's been encrypted, compressed around it, the security has always been a day one job for AWS on it. Once the staging is done, you actually have an option to pivot in recovery also, right? So let's say you want to completely fail over to AWS around it, you can actually create a same subnet into the VPC, or you can actually create a cross-account, cross-region also. So once, as I said, right, once you land on AWS, there are tons of things, of combinations you can actually apply to do a cross-region, cross-account, cross-VPCs, cross-subnets around it to build more resilient around it. Now, when we talk about ransomware, I just a slide on it which actually talks about what EDR can help you. So account isolation, we discussed that you can actually create a staging subnet and a recovery subnet which isolate the primary account for you. The second is immutable snapshots. So all those snapshots which have been created by EBS are immutable, right, by default. That means nobody can tamper it, encrypt it, or access it until unless a specific user go and decrypt those snapshots. And then it also has a EDR integration, right? So how many of us are using CrowdStrike or Sentinel-1 in their organizations? Quite a few, right? EDR integration is also there with Elastic Disaster Recovery Services. And a lot of customers who are building resiliency with AWS wanted to have a perimeter integration with the services they invest in terms of EDR, and then also have end with, let's say, SIM integration with SIM tools you're using it from a monitoring perspective. So it's a complete package for customer when they choose between perimeter security, security available on AWS, as well as the monitoring and controls we have. And the last piece is point-in-time recovery. So you can actually, since you have a EBS snapshot, you can actually do a point-in-time recovery around it, right? Sabit's going to cover a session which will talk about more on the recovery side of it. I'll not take the thunder from him. Now, we discuss about DR, we discuss about migration, right? We discuss data sync as a data migration, and then we discuss about the application stacks and the data which can be migrate using EDR. But there is a thin line between a backup and DR, and right, most of us deploy or consider that they have a disaster recovery or backup in place, but when we start discovering and recommending them in terms of how the solution architect will look like, there are differences available for customers to adopt it. So what actually backup means and DR means, this slide actually represent the difference on it. Backup, when it comes to a recovery point or recovery time objective, because backup mostly happen once in a day, so your RPO and RTOs are, the windows are big enough, right? So let's say you're backing up every 6 p.m. and next day the 6 p.m. the second backup occurs, you have a RPO window of 24 hours, right? In case any corruption or data deletion happen before 6 p.m. With disaster recovery, it's a continuous operation, right? The RPO windows are tight, and I don't want to lose my data because of the business continuity we require. Backup goes with the longer retention periods. The EDR piece is for the instance which are currently running in production, right? So a lot of regulated customers in India have a 5 years, 10 years, or 15 years of retention policy. They can't depend on EDR from a disaster recovery perspective. They need an orchestrator with backup coming in to give them compliances, and we'll be talking about it, backup as well. Now, this is a slide which actually gives you an understanding of the dollar investment or spend when it comes to building a disaster recovery, backup, and high availability. Most of the services in AWS are highly available. So when I say highly available, that means they will be multi-AZ services. Your data has been spread across and written into multiple AZs within Bombay or Hyderabad. That's a high availability. That doesn't define your disaster recovery strategies, because any corruption or deletion happens to one set of data, it will replicate to other set of data on it. That's our definition of high availability. Disaster recovery comes into picture when you want to build a DR. So let's say the application, though it's highly available with multi-AZ as a concept, but the same data is also available in cross-region or cross-account for those set of customers. That's the definition of DR. And when it comes to backup, that means making copies of the data. Corruption can happen anywhere, right? Our CISO always talks about it, that everything will fall at some time. That was the message he actually given, because there is a lot of security resiliency goes in between when customer choose between highly available disaster recovery and backup. And that's where AWS is actually helping you with all the services and tools to build your DR, highly availability, and resiliency. Now let's quickly touch base about the AWS backup. I'll not go much on a deep because we have another session coming with more deep dive onto the AWS backup. But this is what the service currently supports. It's a fully managed service. There are tons of services on AWS native, as well as on-premises what we support from a VMware and Outpost perspective. It's a fully managed service. That means customer need not to manage any of your master servers or media servers on the backup front. The use cases primarily from a backup comes in when it comes to cloud native backups, ransomware recovery, and compliances. While DR will not meet the compliances requirement, let's say if a customer who is RBI aligned or a SEBI aligned in India, if it's a FSI or fintech customer, they need to have a backup outside of their DR strategy around it, right? So that's where backup use cases comes prominent handy with it. And once you're building a backup, ransomware recovery will come as a part of your integration session, which we're gonna see it in next session in detail. Now, one of the things which I wanted to highlight is we've been talking about DR, migration, and AWS backup. But one of the critical is why we need to do it, right? We need to do it that we are confident enough to restore it. And that's where the restore testing is important for customers. You might be having a retention policy of 10 years, but how confident are you as a customer? Let's say we're sitting in 2025, we can recover the data which is in backed up in 2016 or 2015, right? So that's where recover testing or restore testing actually helps customer. And AWS Backup has a restore testing as a template, as a blueprint available for our customer. That means you can actually define the restore testing schedule, you can define what all instances it need to be recovered, and you'll create a framework, reports, and provide to it. So consider it as a backup drill. You can actually perform those restore testing or the services which are running on AWS, giving that confidence to you that, okay, whatever have been backed up, I can actually restore confidently, whether to the auditors or to the business. You can create that and give it to the users as a report. Now I'm on the last few slides from it. Top 10 security best practices which AWS has been talking about. There will be hundreds of it underneath as a subset around it, but implementing a backup strategy, having your backup DR in business continuity, implementing security posture, ensuring your restore testings are intact so that when the disaster happens in terms of any form, you should confident enough to recover your data sets around it. Now, while the day and time is short, but there are plethora of storage services portfolio we have. Each services has their integrated native capabilities of resiliency, disaster recovery around it. Today we covered only 3, data sync, EDR, and AWS backup, but there are tons of storage portfolio which can actually go through. Reach out to your account team to get more deep dive on storage portfolio and services. Now quickly, I'll touch base quickly on 3 customer references I kept it. One is on the EDR perspective. You see this customer, Thomas Router, most of us know him. They actually able to create a DR plan for 300 servers in less than 10 months, including the application tags, OS, data, and able to do a failover and failback using AWS EDR as a solution, right? A very referenceable customer for us. Similarly, second customer, ClearScale. The reason I chose these specific customer, if you see the bandwidth, right? In India, we all know the internet bandwidth between your source location and AWS, and most of the time it's limited. This customer was able to migrate their 30 terabyte of data easily over 50 Mbps of it. So that's the scale I wanted to highlight in terms of what AWS Data Sync can actually help our customers. And the last piece is AWS Backup. Now, if you see from a compliances perspective, Workday, everybody knows Workday, what they deal into in terms of their SaaS offering and services around it. They are one of the major AWS backup user when it comes to compliance and regulatory around it. So we saw EDR as a customer, we saw Data Sync as a customer, and we also seen AWS backup coming up with a lot of native services and capability to provide it, right? With that note, I'll hand it over to for the next sessions. Thank you so much, everyone, and have a nice evening. Thank you.